Welcome to Module 1 of Chapter 2, Theories of Development for our Lifespan Development course, Psych 280. And so we are now firmly into the content of this semester. And so today we're going to go ahead and start the first few of the 7 modules for Chapter 2. Now, I know this is a relatively new part of the course and we haven't been doing this a lot, but let me tell you that Chapter 2 is probably one of the more important chapters for you to pay attention to. And I know with it being so early in the course that you don't know that I'm not going to say that for every chapter, but I won't. It is by far the most important because these theories are going to come up again several times throughout the rest of the chapters that we'll be reviewing here. For example, we're going to talk about Jean Piaget, and Piaget is a big part of Chapter 7. There are other theorists, too, that we're going to get exposed to in this chapter that are going to come up again. So when I say to spend the most time or spend a lot of time kind of getting to know this chapter and its content, what I really mean is for you to kind of get prepared to see this content again, and why not learn it now if you already are going to need it later on. And so let's go ahead and get started talking about this. So as I was discussing for this particular module, Module 1, what we're going to look at is human nature, and then we're going to first address a little bit of Freud's psychoanalytic theory. And so the human nature aspect is going to talk about some basic assumptions that we make about human nature. And one of those we already went over in Chapter 1 briefly, which was the nature-nurture kind of conundrum. And so nature-nurture is going to be the first one, and hopefully the easiest for you all to remember because it comes up so often. If you remember back in Chapter 1, when I was talking about nature-nurture, it was really revolving around the influence of heredity versus the environment and how much of development is influenced by each. Okay, and this is mostly what we inherit, that's heredity, and then the environment is everything that's going to influence us and our outward environment there. So that's one of the issues. The next one is the issue of activity versus passivity. And an activity versus passivity, it's the belief of whether children are active in their own development or they're just kind of sitting back, taking it all in and learning from what others are doing. And so our theorists are going to be going back and forth on a lot of these assumptions, and activity passivity is certainly one of them. On one end, you have Piaget, who's a big believer in active development of children, whereas with Bandura, you have what we call the social learning theory, and it's a much more passive take. And once again, it's not all or none. Children certainly learn things passively, but they also are very active. Anyone who's been around a young child's household, parents will have all sorts of things latched up because the curious and active child tends to get into them, whether these are toilets, refrigerators, or anything else. The third assumption is continuity versus discontinuity. The idea is, with continuity theorists, is that the course of development is more of small, gradual steps where things kind of go up without or in a very smooth manner, without these major leaps ahead. That's what we call continuity. Discontinuity, this is where you have it more as a series of stair steps. So if you think of kind of going from nothing to another leap ahead, nothing to another leap ahead, a lot of times these theorists will describe development in stages, and each stage is a major step. So discontinuity theorists, for instance, are like Erik Erikson and Piaget. Continuity theorists, those are a little bit lesser known. We'll talk of those towards the end of this chapter. And the final one of the big assumptions that are debated about in theories of human development is the issue of universal versus kind of a context-specific development. Now, when we were first starting to understand child development way back when, the idea was that all of the discoveries applied universally. And so the assumption was that anything that the theorists had found or the researchers found applied to all children. And of course, most of that research was done with either children in the middle class, white children in the United States or in Europe. And what we find as we broaden the field of development is that it's far from the case. There are a lot of context-specific developments, including on how quickly some milestones are reached that we'll be talking about, and that there are relatively few universal developmental characteristics that tend to occur at the same time for the children for the same at the same point in their development. One of those examples is early speech, such as cooing and babbling, tend to be universal developments. But almost everything else is some sort of context specificity. So what I want you to do is keep in mind all four of these assumptions as we begin to discuss the rest of these theorists throughout the rest of this chapter in the next 6 modules. So the very first theorist that we're going to talk about is Sigmund Freud. And as you can see, old Sigmund there has got quite a glower. And it's amazing that he had so much insight given kind of his general look and demeanor. But you got to remember, this was back in the Victorian age and a very different kind of aspect. And he was at the very beginning of psychology and the whole use of psychology in a counseling context. Now, what Freud espoused, and he espoused a lot, and we're not going to get into him a whole bunch, and we probably won't see him for the rest of the semester, but he did have a powerful influence in the field of developmental psychology, even though that's not what he's primarily associated with. And so we're first going to talk about here in this module about his components of personality and his idea that there are unconscious motivations. These unconscious motivations are instincts and other inner forces that influence the behavior around us, even though we're not really fully aware of it. It's in our subconscious. So when we talk about instincts, we're talking about these inborn biological forces that motivate us to behave in a certain manner. And the moment we're born, the very first of the components of personality come to the forefront, and that is the id. The id operates under something called the pleasure principle, the kind of if it feels good, do it. It seeks out immediate gratification, and its whole mission is to satisfy the various instincts that are going on in an individual. And you can kind of see why Freud would think that an infant is all id. If I have to poop, I'm going to just poop when I need to. Hence, that's why babies wear diapers. If I'm hungry, I'm going to go eat. If I can't eat, I'm going to scream until I can eat. Okay, this is the id in total control. And if you think about an infant, they really don't control much of anything. Their needs are very transparent. And hopefully parents pick up on that so they can meet those needs. Now, as a little bit of time goes on, what we begin to see is the development of the ego. Now, the ego is the rational side of the individual, and it operates under something called the reality principle, where it's trying to find a way to gratify the instincts, which is the id, just constantly, but do it within a way that it can be done in a socially acceptable manner. So if you have to poop, well, don't just do it in the diaper or on the planter. Why don't we wait and just for a little bit and go to something called a toilet and relieve ourselves there? Okay, that's the ego and trying to get us to fit in society. And Freud said the ego develops, probably going on maybe 9 months to a year after the id starts. And it develops based on social feedback. Because obviously, when you come into this world, you have no idea what the standards are. But by 9 months to a year, you're beginning to understand, and that's where the ego comes into play. Now, the last one to develop, usually not until about 3 to 6 years old, is the superego. And the superego is the internalized moral standards that the child has developed over those first few years of life. And that's based on feedback from the society they're growing up in and their parents' feedback on their own behavior. Now, the superego is striving for perfection rather than pleasure or realism like the id and ego. And so you can see there's a dynamic right there that's going to be very hard to mitigate. You've got the id that wants it and wants it right now. You got the superego that wants to live up to these high internalized moral standards. And then you have the ego. And the ego is definitely in between. these various components as they kind of battle each other out. So that's setting the stage for what we'll be talking about in Module 2, which is Freud's theory of child development called the psychosexual stages of development. And the good thing is that you can understand what the focus is going to be on the theory of how psychology and sexual instincts combine for overall development. So that'll be our next module in Module 2.